The Oregon Territory in 1847 stretched like a green ocean of forests and meadows, broken by snow-capped peaks and rivers that sang ancient songs to the wind. In this vast wilderness, 18-year-old Elena Thorne lived a life as quiet as the morning mist that rolled through the Cascade Mountains. Elena's small cabin sat in a hidden valley 20 miles from the nearest settlement of Willow Creek, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and a meadow that bloomed with wildflowers each spring. She had built this life of solitude deliberately, seeking refuge from a world that had shown her little kindness since childhood. Orphaned at 7 when fever took her parents during the wagon train journey west, Elena had been passed from family to family like an unwanted burden. Each new household had promised care and shelter, but what she'd found instead was endless chores, sharp words, and the constant reminder that she was there on sufferance. By 15, she'd learned that silence was safer than speech, observation wiser than participation. When the Hendersons, her last reluctant guardians, had decided to return east rather than face another harsh Oregon winter, Elena had made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. She would stay, alone. The small inheritance from her parents' belongings would buy her a few supplies and tools. The wilderness would provide the rest. For 3 years, she'd live this way, hunting, gathering, growing vegetables in a small garden, and trading occasionally with friendly native tribes who respected her quiet ways and honest dealings. She spoke little, observed much, and had learned to read the forest, like a book written in birdsong and wind. Patterns. Elena was checking her rabbit snares on a crisp autumn morning when she heard something that didn't belong to the forest's natural symphony. The sound of men's voices, harsh and angry, echoing from the direction of Devil's Canyon about 2 miles north of her cabin. She crept through the underbrush with the silent skill 3 years of solitary living had taught her, following the sounds until she reached a vantage point where she could see down into the rocky canyon. What she saw made her blood run cold. 5 white men, rough-looking trappers by their clothing and equipment, had set up what appeared to be a makeshift prison camp. Tied to a post driven deep into the rocky ground was a Native American warrior, stripped to the waist and bearing evidence of brutal treatment. Even from a distance, Elena could see the blood on his back and the way he held himself, conscious but clearly suffering. The trappers were taking turns tormenting their captive, throwing rocks, poking him with sticks, and laughing at his stoic refusal to cry out. Elena recognized the evil in their laughter, the casual cruelty of men who had forgotten that their victim was human. Chief Thundercloud's favorite warrior, one of the trappers was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Worth a fortune if we can get him to Fort Vancouver alive. The Army's been wanting to get their hands on him for months. If he lives that long, another laughed harshly. Been 3 days since he's had water. Much longer and he won't be worth anything to anybody. Elena's heart clenched with familiar pain. She knew what it felt like to be helpless, to be at the mercy of people who saw you as less than human. The warrior's dignified silence in the face of torture reminded her of her own strategy for survival. Endure, stay silent, wait for the moment to act. But this man couldn't wait. He was dying slowly, and his captors were enjoying every moment of it. Elena studied the camp with the careful attention she gave to everything in her world. 5 men, but they were confident in their superiority and careless in their watch. They'd built their fire near the canyon entrance, leaving shadows and blind spots around the prisoner's location. Most importantly, they were drunk, passing around a bottle and growing louder and more careless as the afternoon wore on. She could free him. The question was whether she should. Elena had spent 3 years avoiding human contact, staying clear of the conflicts between settlers and native tribes that occasionally flared into violence. Her safety depended on being invisible, unknown, uninvolved. Freeing this warrior would end that safety forever. But as she watched the man endure another round of torment without breaking, Elena felt something stir in her chest that had been dormant for years. The need to act, to help, to be something more than just another victim of circumstances. She waited until dusk, when the trappers had consumed enough whiskey to make them careless and loud. Moving through the forest like a shadow, Elena circled around the canyon to approach from the blind side where the rocks would hide her movements. The warrior sensed her presence before she reached him, his dark eyes meeting hers in the fading light. Elena saw recognition there, not of her specifically, but of intent. He knew she was there to help, and his eyes held a mixture of surprise and warning. Elena pressed a finger to her lips in the universal gesture for silence, then drew the knife she used for hunting, and began sawing carefully at the rawhide bonds that held him to the post. The leather was thick and strong, but her blade was sharp and her determination stronger. As she worked, Elena could hear the trappers arguing drunkenly about their plans, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. They were debating whether to move their prisoner in the morning or wait another day for him to weaken further. The rawhide finally parted, and the warrior's hands came free. Elena quickly moved to cut the bonds around his ankles while he worked, feeling back into his arms. She could see him testing his strength, calculating whether he could walk, much less fight if necessary. Elena pulled a small water container from her pack and held it to his lips. He drank gratefully but sparingly, understanding that too much too fast could make him sick. When he'd had enough, he mouthed a single word. Why? Elena met his eyes directly and saw intelligence, courage, and a depth of character that made her decision feel inevitable rather than chosen. She couldn't answer his question with words. She barely understood it herself. Instead, she simply touched her heart, then pointed toward the forest that would give him cover for escape. The warrior studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing her features. Then he touched his own heart and pointed to her, a gesture that somehow felt like both gratitude and promise. Elena helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as quietly as possible while he tested his ability to walk. He was weak but determined, and after a few tentative steps, he was able to move on his own. She led him to the edge of the canyon where the shadows were deepest, then pointed toward a game trail that would take him away from the trapper's camp and toward the deep forest where he could find safety. Before he disappeared into the darkness, the warrior turned back to her one last time. He spoke a few words in his native language so softly they were barely audible, then melted into the forest like smoke. Elena waited in the shadows until she was certain he was safely away, then began her own careful retreat toward her cabin. By the time the trappers discovered their prisoner was gone, she was miles away, leaving no trace of her involvement. But as she lay in her bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the Oregon wilderness, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of having acted on her conscience rather than her fear. She had no way of knowing that her simple act of compassion had just changed the course of a conflict that had been building toward war, or that the warrior she'd saved carried influence that extended far beyond anything she could imagine. The silent girl had found her voice through action rather than words, and soon the entire Oregon Territory would understand the power of what she'd done in the darkness of Devil's Canyon. 3 days passed quietly after Elena's midnight rescue in Devil's Canyon. She went about her usual routines, tending her garden, checking her snares, gathering the last of the autumn berries, but with a heightened awareness that hadn't been there before. Every sound in the forest seemed sharper, every shadow potentially significant. On the morning of the 4th day, Elena woke to absolute silence. In 3 years of wilderness living, she'd learned to read the moods of the forest like weather patterns. There was the busy silence of predators hunting, the cautious silence of prey hiding, and the peaceful silence of a forest at rest. This was something else entirely, a silence that felt like the entire wilderness was holding its breath. Elena dressed quickly and stepped onto her small porch, immediately understanding why the forest had gone quiet. They were everywhere. Warriors on horseback surrounded her cabin in concentric circles that stretched as far as she could see through the trees. Elena counted the first ring, 30 men sitting their horses with perfect stillness. Beyond them, she could make out more riders, and beyond those, still more. The morning mist that drifted through the Douglas firs revealed glimpses of feathers, painted faces, and weapons held in positions of honor rather than threat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but Elena forced herself to remain calm. She'd learned long ago that running from overwhelming situations only made them worse. Instead, she stood quietly on her porch and waited to understand what was happening. A single rider separated himself from the nearest circle and approached her cabin slowly. As he came closer, Elena recognized him. The warrior she'd freed from Devil's Canyon, though he looked completely different now. Gone were the wounds and signs of torture, replaced by ceremonial paint, eagle feathers in his dark hair, and clothing that marked him as someone of considerable importance. He stopped his horse about 20 feet from her porch and dismounted with fluid grace. When he looked at her, Elena saw the same intelligence and depth she'd recognized in the canyon. But now there was something else, a respect and gratitude that made her feel oddly humble. "I am Standing Bear, War Chief of the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs," he said in careful but clear English. His voice carried across the silent clearing with natural authority. "You are the one who freed me from my captors." Elena nodded but said nothing, unsure what was expected of her. Standing Bear gestured toward the rings of warriors surrounding her cabin. "I have brought my brothers to honor your courage and offer you the protection of our people." Elena found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "I don't understand." 3 nights ago, you risked your life to save a stranger," Standing Bear explained. "You asked for nothing in return, expected no reward, sought no recognition. Such actions are rare in any people, but especially between our peoples, who have seen too much suspicion and violence." Elena looked around at the massive gathering of warriors, beginning to grasp the significance of what was happening. "You came all this way just to thank me?" "We came to honor you," Standing Bear corrected gently, "and to offer you something that no white person in this territory has ever been offered. Full adoption into our tribes as family, with all the rights and protection that such adoption brings." Elena stared at him in shock. "Adoption? But I'm just—" "You are a woman of great courage who chose compassion over safety," Standing Bear interrupted. "Among our people, such character matters more than blood or birth." Another rider approached from the second circle, an elderly man whose bearing suggested he was a chief or elder of considerable importance. Standing Bear turned to him with obvious respect. "This is Chief Joseph of the Nez." "Purse," Standing Bear said to Elena. "He has traveled 4 days to be here." Chief Joseph dismounted and approached Elena with dignified steps. He was older than Standing Bear, perhaps 60, with silver streaking his black hair and eyes that held the wisdom of decades. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority earned through years of leadership. "Young woman," Chief Joseph said in English that was more accented than Standing Bear's but equally clear, "Standing Bear has told us of your courage. But it is not just your bravery that brings us here. It is your silence." "My silence?" Elena asked, confused. "You freed a warrior and asked no questions," Chief Joseph explained. "You did not demand to know who he was, what tribe he belonged to, or why he was imprisoned. You simply saw a human being in need and acted to help him. Such wisdom is rare. I couldn't leave him there," Elena said simply. "Yes." Chief Joseph smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "That is exactly why we are here." Standing Bear stepped forward again. "Elena Thorne, the Confederated Tribes offer you adoption as a daughter of our people. You would have the protection of every warrior here, the wisdom of our elders and a voice in our councils. You would never again be alone or unprotected." Elena felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what was being offered. After years of being unwanted, passed from family to family like a burden, she was being invited to join not just one family but an entire confederation of tribes. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say nothing now," Chief Joseph advised kindly. "This is a decision that requires thought and prayer. But know this, your act of courage has already changed much." The trappers who held Standing Bear prisoner were part of a group planning attacks on tribal villages. By freeing him, you allowed him to warn our people and prevent much bloodshed. Elena's eyes widened. "I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Standing Bear said. "You acted from the heart, not from calculation. That is what makes your courage pure." A third rider approached from the outer circles, this one a woman slightly older than Elena, wearing the dress and ornaments that marked her as someone of high status within her tribe. "This is Morning Star, daughter of Chief Joseph and a leader among the Women's Council," Standing Bear introduced. "She wishes to speak with you." Morning Star dismounted and approached Elena with a warm smile that immediately put her at ease. "Sister," she said in English, "may I see your home?" Elena nodded and led Morning Star into her small cabin, acutely aware of how humble her living conditions must seem to someone accustomed to tribal leadership. But Morning Star examined everything with obvious approval. The neat organization, the evidence of skilled hands in the preserved foods and crafted tools, the small garden visible through the window. "You live well alone," Morning Star observed. "This shows wisdom and strength. Among our people, such skills are highly valued." "It's not much," Elena said self-consciously. "It is everything. Morningstar corrected. You have made a life from nothing, survived alone in the wilderness, and remained kind despite hardship. These are the qualities we seek in our daughters. They returned to the porch where Standing Bear and Chief Joseph waited patiently. Elena looked around at the hundreds of warriors still sitting their horses in perfect silence, overwhelmed by the display of respect and honor. Why so many? She asked. If you just wanted to thank me. Because your act of courage deserves to be witnessed, Standing Bear explained. Because the story of what you did will be told around our fires for generations. And because we wanted you to understand that you are not being offered charity. You are being offered membership in a family that spans multiple tribes and thousands of people. Elena felt tears prick her eyes as the full meaning of their offer began to sink in. After years of silence and isolation, she was being invited to join a community that valued her actions and offered her the belonging she'd never known. How long do I have to decide? She asked. As long as you need, Chief Joseph replied. But know that our protection begins now, whether you accept adoption or not. The trappers who held Standing Bear prisoner have sworn vengeance against whoever freed him. You are no longer safe living alone. Elena looked around at the massive gathering of warriors, then back at the three leaders who had come to honor her simple act of compassion. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't feel alone. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, Standing Bear replied. We will make camp nearby while you consider our offer. Take all the time you need. As the three leaders prepared to leave, Morningstar touched Elena's arm gently. Sister, whatever you decide, remember this, you are already part of our family in your heart. The ceremony would simply make it official. Elena watched as the massive gathering of warriors began to disperse, forming camps in the meadows and clearings around her valley. The silent girl who had freed a captive warrior was about to make a decision that would change not just her own life, but the entire balance of power in the Oregon Territory. The question was whether she had the courage to accept a belonging she'd never dared to hope for. Elena spent 2 days walking the forest paths around her cabin, thinking about the offer that had been extended to her. The warrior camps were visible from every high point in her valley, not as a threat, but as a constant reminder that her life had irrevocably changed the moment she'd cut Standing Bear's bonds in Devil's Canyon. Morningstar visited her each day, sitting quietly on Elena's porch and sharing stories of tribal life without pressing for a decision. Elena learned that the adoption offer wasn't just ceremonial. It would make her a full member of the Confederation with responsibilities as well as rights. Our women have voices in all major decisions, Morningstar explained on the second evening as they watched the sun set over the camps. We choose our own paths, speak in council, and our opinions carry weight equal to the men's. But we also share in the duties of protecting our people and maintaining our traditions. I've lived alone for so long, Elena said quietly. I'm not sure I remember how to be part of a family. Family isn't something you remember, Morningstar replied gently. It's something you choose every day. The heart knows how to love and be loved. It just needs permission to try again. On the third morning, Elena woke to find Standing Bear waiting respectfully outside her cabin. His expression was serious, and she could sense that something had changed overnight. What's wrong? She asked, stepping onto her porch. Runners came in the night with troubling news. Standing Bear replied, The trappers who held me prisoner have allied themselves with a group of settlers who believe all native people should be driven from Oregon Territory. They're organizing a militia to attack our villages. Elena felt a chill of fear. How large a militia? Perhaps 200 men armed and determined. They plan to strike during the new moon when darkness will hide their movements. Standing Bear's expression grew grim. They also know that someone freed me, and they've sworn to find and punish whoever helped me escape. Do they know it was me? Not yet. But they're searching, and it's only a matter of time before they question everyone in the area. Standing Bear met her eyes directly. Elena, you are no longer safe living alone. Whether you accept adoption into our tribes or not, you cannot remain here unprotected. Elena looked around at her small cabin, the garden she'd tended, the life she'd built from nothing over 3 years of solitary work. The thought of abandoning it all felt like losing the only stability she'd ever known. What are my options? She asked. Come with us to our winter camps in the mountains where you'll be safe regardless of your decision about adoption, Standing Bear replied. Or, He paused as if weighing his words carefully. Help us prevent the attack entirely. Help you how? I'm not a warrior. No, but you're something potentially more valuable. Someone who can move between both worlds without suspicion. Standing Bear's tone grew thoughtful. The militia is meeting tomorrow night at the Jameson Ranch to finalize their plans. If someone could learn the details of their attack. Elena understood immediately. You want me to spy on them? I want to give you the chance to save lives on both sides, Standing Bear corrected. This militia believes they're fighting savages who show no mercy. They don't understand that we prefer peace to war, negotiation to violence. If we knew their plans, we could arrange a demonstration of our strength that might convince them to abandon their attack without bloodshed. Elena considered this carefully. The idea terrified her. She'd spent years avoiding confrontation of any kind. But she also understood the potential consequences of inaction. War would mean death for innocent people on both sides, and the escalating cycle of violence would make peaceful coexistence impossible. What kind of demonstration? She asked. Standing Bear smiled grimly. The same kind we gave you when we came to offer adoption. Sometimes showing overwhelming strength is the most merciful way to prevent a fight. Before Elena could respond, Chief Joseph appeared at the edge of the clearing, approaching with his usual dignified pace but with obvious urgency in his bearing. Standing Bear, Elena, he greeted them formally. I bring news from our scouts. The militia has grown larger than we thought. Nearly 300 men now, including some from as far away as California. They're better organized and better armed than our initial report suggested. Elena felt her heart sink. That changes everything, doesn't it? It changes the stakes, Chief Joseph confirmed. A conflict of this size would likely draw in the territorial government and possibly federal troops. It could spark a war that spreads throughout the Pacific Northwest. Standing Bear was quiet for a moment, clearly calculating new possibilities. Which makes intelligence about their plans even more crucial. Elena, what you're being asked to do has become more dangerous, but also more important. Elena stood up and walked to the edge of her porch, looking out at the peaceful valley that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. The morning mist was lifting from the meadows, revealing the warrior camps that had transformed her solitary world into something larger and more complex. If I do this, she said finally, and if we can prevent the attack, what happens then? This conflict won't just disappear. No, Chief Joseph agreed, but it might give us time to find a peaceful solution. The territorial governor is a reasonable man who prefers negotiation to warfare. If we can prevent this militia attack, we can approach him with a proposal for formal peace talks. And if the spy mission fails? If I'm caught? Standing Bear's expression grew very serious. Then you would likely be killed. And the militia would attack our villages believing they had divine permission for their violence. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. 3 days ago, she'd been a solitary woman living quietly in the wilderness. Now she was being asked to help prevent a war. I need to understand something, she said, turning back to face the 2 leaders. Why me? You have warriors who could sneak into their meeting just as easily. No white person would believe intelligence gathered by native scouts, Chief Joseph explained. They would assume it was lies or exaggeration. But if you could confirm what we've heard about their plans, the territorial governor would have to take the threat seriously. Also, Standing Bear added gently, you've already proven that you can act with courage when lives are at stake. We trust your judgment and your heart. Elena looked between the 2 men who had come to honor her simple act of compassion, and somehow ended up asking her to help prevent a war. The irony wasn't lost on her. The girl who'd spent years avoiding human contact was being asked to save both communities from destroying each other. If I agree to this, she said slowly, I want something in return. Name it, Chief Joseph replied immediately. I want your word that if this works, if we prevent the attack and open peace talks, you'll include provisions for people like me. People who don't quite fit in either world but want to build bridges between them. Standing Bear smiled, the expression lighting up his weathered features. Elena Thorne, you're already thinking like a tribal leader. Yes, you have our word. Elena took a deep breath, feeling as if she was about to step off a cliff into unknown darkness. Then I'll do it. But I do it as a member of your family, not as an outsider helping strangers. You're accepting adoption? Morningstar's voice came from behind them, and Elena turned to see the woman approaching with obvious joy on her face. I'm accepting the family that chose me. Elena replied firmly. And now we have work to do. As the four of them began planning the most dangerous mission of Elena's life, she realized that the silent girl who'd lived alone for 3 years was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had found her people and was willing to risk everything to protect them. The real test of her courage was just beginning. The Jameson Ranch sat in a valley 15 miles southeast of Elena's cabin, a prosperous spread that had grown wealthy by selling supplies to wagon trains heading west on the Oregon Trail. Elena had traded there occasionally over the past 3 years, always keeping her interactions brief and unremarkable. She hoped that reputation for quiet reliability would serve her well tonight. She approached the ranch just after sunset, dressed in her best clothes and carrying a basket of preserved fruits from her garden, a believable excuse for an evening visit. The story she'd prepared was simple. She'd heard about the militia gathering and wanted to offer food and support for the men who were protecting the territory from Indian attacks. The ranch yard buzzed with activity as armed men arrived from throughout the region. Elena counted at least 40 horses already tied to hitching posts and fences, with more riders approaching from multiple directions. The scale of the gathering confirmed Chief Joseph's fears. This was far more than a local response to tribal tensions. Elena took a steadying breath and approached the main house, where lantern light spilled from windows and the sound of many voices indicated the meeting was already underway. She knocked on the door with what she hoped was appropriate nervous determination. Mrs. Jameson answered, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who Elena recognized from previous trading visits. Elena Thorne, what brings you out here so late? Mrs. Jameson, I heard about the militia gathering, Elena said, lifting her basket. I wanted to contribute what I could to support the men who are protecting us from the Indian threat. Mrs. Jameson's expression softened slightly. That's very thoughtful, dear. Though I'm surprised you made the journey alone. It's dangerous for a woman to travel at night with all these savages prowling about. I felt it was my duty, Elena replied, trying to project the earnest conviction she hoped would get her inside. After hearing about the attacks being planned, I couldn't just sit safely in my cabin while good men risked their lives for all of us. Attacks? Mrs. Jameson looked puzzled. I don't know anything about planned attacks. The meeting tonight is about preventing them. Elena felt a chill of apprehension. The intelligence that Standing Bear had received suggested the militia was planning an offensive strike. If Mrs. Jameson was telling the truth, then either the information was wrong or the woman was being kept ignorant of her husband's real intentions. Perhaps I misunderstood, Elena said carefully. I'd be grateful if you could clarify what the meeting is actually about. Mrs. Jameson gestured for Elena to enter, leading her through a hallway toward the back of the house where the men's voices were loudest. From what I understand, they're organizing patrols to protect our farms and families. Thomas says the Indians have been gathering in large numbers and we need to be ready to defend ourselves. As they approached the main room, Elena could hear individual voices more clearly. What she heard made her blood run cold. Hit them at dawn when they're least prepared, a harsh voice was saying. Burn the camps, scatter the survivors, show them that Oregon territory isn't safe for their kind anymore. What about prisoners? Another voice asked. The army might want to question some of them. No prisoners, the first voice replied flatly. Prisoners mean witnesses, and witnesses mean investigations. We do this clean and complete, then claim we were defending ourselves from an attack. Elena felt sweat begin to bead on her forehead despite the cool evening air. Word travels, Mr. Jameson. People talk about protecting their families from Indian attacks. Yes, they do, Jameson agreed slowly. The question is which people you've been talking to. Before Elena could respond, another man emerged from the meeting room, a rough-looking individual she recognized as one of the trappers from Devil's Canyon. Her heart nearly stopped as she realized he might recognize her from that night. Tom, what's the delay? The trapper asked. We need to finalize the timing before... He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes fell on Elena, and she saw recognition dawn in his expression. Well, the trapper said with a cruel smile. Look what we have here. The little mouse who's been living alone in the woods. Funny coincidence, her showing up tonight. You know this woman? Jameson asked. Know her? Hell, I've been looking for her, the trapper replied. See, we had a prisoner a few days back and someone helped him escape. Someone who knew those woods well enough to get in and out without being seen. Elena felt the trap closing around her but forced herself to remain calm. I don't know what you're talking about. I keep to myself and avoid trouble. Is that so? The trapper stepped closer, his eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. Then maybe you can explain how a prisoner tied with 4 layers of rawhide managed to cut himself free with no knife and no help. The room fell silent as the implications of the trapper's words became clear. Elena could see the suspicion crystallizing into certainty on Jameson's face, and she knew her mission was over. Search her, Jameson ordered coldly. If she's the one who freed that savage, she's been spying on us tonight. Elena backed toward the door, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife she carried for protection. But before she could draw it, 3 men had blocked her escape route while 2 others moved to grab her arms. Mrs. Jameson, Elena called out desperately, please remember what you heard tonight. Innocent people are going to die unless someone stops this. Shut her up, Jameson snapped, and tie her up good. We'll deal with her after we finish planning the attack. As rough hands seized her arms and began binding them with rope, Elena's last coherent thought was that she'd failed. The intelligence she'd gathered would die with her, and the massacre would proceed as planned. But she'd underestimated the power of the words she'd spoken to Mrs. Jameson, and the courage that even the most unlikely people could find when faced with unconscionable evil. The silent girl's voice had finally found its power, and it would soon echo in ways she never could have imagined. Elena spent a terrifying night tied up in the Jameson Ranch cellar, listening to the sounds of the militia finalizing their attack plans above her head. Through the wooden floor, she could hear fragments of conversation that confirmed her worst fears. They planned to strike at dawn, targeting 3 separate tribal camps with coordinated attacks designed to prevent any survivors from escaping, to warn others. As the hours crawled by, Elena fought against her bonds and tried to think of any way to escape and warn Standing Bear's people. But the trappers had tied her with professional skill, and the cellar door was locked from outside. She could only listen in growing desperation as the militia made their final preparations for what would be a massacre. Dawn was breaking when Elena heard the first sounds that gave her hope. Hoofbeats, many of them, approaching the ranch at speed. At first she thought it might be more militia members arriving, but the sound was wrong. These riders moved with coordinated precision that spoke of military discipline rather than the loose organization of angry settlers. Shouts erupted from the yard above, followed by the crash of the cellar door being flung open. Elena squinted against the sudden light as a figure descended the steps, and her heart leaped as she recognized Standing Bear. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, cutting her bonds with swift, efficient movements. "I'm all right," Elena gasped, trying to work feeling back into her hands. But Standing Bear, they're planning to attack at dawn. 3 camps, coordinated strikes designed to kill everyone and claim self-defense. "We know," Standing Bear replied grimly. "Mrs. Jameson rode to our camp in the middle of the night. She told us everything she heard and warned us that you'd been captured." Elena's eyes widened in amazement. "Mrs. Jameson? She came to warn you. A brave woman who chose conscience over comfort," Standing Bear confirmed. She also brought detailed information about the militia's numbers, weapons, and planned routes of attack. As they climbed out of the cellar, Elena could see the full scope of what had occurred during her captivity. The Jameson Ranch was surrounded by what appeared to be every warrior from the tribal confederation, plus many more she didn't recognize. The sight was overwhelming. Hundreds of mounted warriors in full battle regalia, their presence so imposing that the militia members had already thrown down their weapons in surrender. 300? Elena asked in amazement. "Nearly 500, Standing Bear corrected. Word of the planned massacre spread quickly through all the tribal networks. Chiefs from as far away as the Columbia River came to prevent this atrocity. In the ranch yard, Elena could see the militia members standing in a tight group, their faces pale with shock and fear. Thomas Jameson stood slightly apart from the others, his expression a mixture of defiance and growing realization that his plans had been completely exposed. Chief Joseph sat his horse near the center of the gathering, his bearing dignified but his voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. "Thomas Jameson," he called out formally, "you and your men planned to murder innocent families while they slept. You planned to burn villages where children live and play. What justification do you offer for such cowardice?" Jameson's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Those savages were planning to attack our settlements. We were defending ourselves." Where is your evidence of these planned attacks? Chief Joseph asked calmly, what proof do you have that our people intended violence against yours? The question hung in the air as Jameson struggled to respond. Elena could see him looking around at his fellow militia members, none of whom seemed willing to support his claims with actual evidence. We don't need proof to protect our families, one of the other militia leaders called out. Your kind has been raiding and killing since we first came to Oregon. Standing Bear urged his horse forward, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief addressing enemies. Name one raid. Give us one example of unprovoked violence by our people against your settlements in the past 2 years. The challenge was met with uncomfortable silence. Elena realized that the militia's justifications were based on fear and prejudice rather than actual attacks or threats. The truth, Chief Joseph continued, is that you planned this massacre not in defense of your families, but in hope of claiming our lands once we were driven away or destroyed. This was not defense, it was attempted genocide for profit. Mrs. Jameson stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the house, her face pale but her voice strong. Chiefs, I want to formally apologize for my husband's actions and disavow any support for this evil plan. What you prevented today was indeed massacre, and I thank God you stopped it before innocent blood was shed. Her public repudiation of the militia's plan seemed to break something in the group's resolve. Several other men began speaking up, distancing themselves from the leadership and claiming they'd been misled about the true nature of the mission. Elena watched this unfolding with a mixture of relief and amazement. The intelligence mission that had seemed like such a failure was actually providing the foundation for something unprecedented, a public confrontation that was exposing the militia's true intentions and undermining their support throughout the community. Elena Thorne, Chief Joseph called out, gesturing for her to approach. Come forward and tell these men what you heard during their planning meeting. Elena felt every eye in the gathering focus on her as she walked to the center of the yard. For someone who'd spent years avoiding attention, being the focal point of such a massive assembly was overwhelming. But she forced herself to speak clearly and truthfully. I heard them planning to attack at dawn, she said, her voice carrying farther than she'd expected. They talked about burning camps, killing everyone including children, and claiming afterward that they were defending themselves from an attack that was never planned. You're lying, Thomas Jameson shouted. You're a traitor who sides with savages against your own kind. I'm someone who refuses to stand by and watch innocent people be murdered, Elena replied with growing confidence. And I'm proud to stand with people who value honor and truth over fear and greed. Standing Bear dismounted and walked to stand beside Elena, his presence both protective and supportive. This woman risked her life to prevent bloodshed on both sides. She represents the kind of courage and compassion that could build lasting peace between our peoples. Peace? One of the militia members scoffed. There can't be peace between whites and Indians. We're too different. Are we? Morningstar's voice carried clearly as she rode forward from the ranks of warriors. I see a white woman who chose to save a life rather than preserve her own safety. I see a white woman who risked capture and death to prevent a massacre. She seems quite capable of understanding honor and compassion. Elena felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the full significance of what was happening. The silent girl who'd lived alone for 3 years had become the symbol of what was possible between two peoples who'd been taught to see each other as enemies. Chief Joseph raised his hand for silence, his gesture instantly stilling the murmur of voices throughout the gathering. Thomas Jameson, you and your militia will disband immediately. Any man found carrying weapons against our people will be treated as an enemy combatant. However, those who genuinely wish to pursue peace will find us willing to talk. What about our prisoner? Jameson demanded, pointing at Elena. She's a traitor who aided enemy warriors. She is under the protection of the Confederated Tribes, Standing Bear replied with steel in his voice. Any harm that comes to her will be considered an act of war against all our peoples. The threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that several militia members stepped back involuntarily. Elena realized that her act of freeing Standing Bear had indeed changed everything, not just for her, but for the entire balance of power in the Oregon Territory. Furthermore, Chief Joseph announced, we are sending envoys to the territorial governor with a full account of this planned massacre and an offer to negotiate a formal peace treaty. Elena Thorne will accompany our delegation as evidence that cooperation between our peoples is not only possible, but beneficial to all. Elena stared at him in shock. You want me to go to the territorial capital? We want you to help us build the peace that your courage has made possible, Chief Joseph replied with a warm smile. You've already proven that you can bridge our two worlds. Now we're asking you to help make that bridge permanent. As the massive gathering of warriors began to disperse, and the militia members were released to return to their homes with stern warnings about future behavior, Elena found herself surrounded by tribal leaders eager to discuss the diplomatic mission ahead. Are you ready for this? Standing Bear asked quietly as they walked toward the horses. Elena looked around at the people who had become her family, then back at the ranch where her intelligence mission had nearly ended in disaster, but ultimately helped prevent a war. 3 days ago, I was a silent girl living alone in the woods, she said with a laugh that held more joy than she'd felt in years. Now I'm apparently going to help negotiate a treaty between two peoples. I'm not sure anyone can be ready for that kind of change. Perhaps, Morningstar said, joining their conversation with obvious affection in her voice. But you're the right person for it. You've already proven that silence can speak louder than words when it comes from a heart full of courage. As they rode away from the Jameson Ranch toward a future none of them could have imagined, Elena reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple act of compassion in Devil's Canyon. The orphan girl who'd freed a captive warrior in silence had found her voice, her family, and her purpose. The real adventure was just beginning, but Elena Thorne was no longer facing it alone.